You know, we had some very interesting discussion at the earlier session where we looked at ideas and history, and many of the questions were about how do you put that into practice? How do you manage the balance between heritage and heritage conservation and development? How do you look towards the future? And this panel, we've seen two presentations with real examples of how they've tried to do it in Georgetown and with many projects by Jason. So maybe we can think about how this second session might answer some of those questions and ideas that were percolating around for us that came up in the first session. Please, Andrew.
Hello, my name is Andrew, and I did the waterfront exhibition anyway, you know, so I wanted to, there was a question today, a very extremely inspiring lecture by Imran, yeah, but as well as from all of you. The question I kept thinking about is, because I love old architecture, but how the pressure, especially from the URA, how much what do you choose to preserve? And I was looking at Salma's, and you know, you have beautiful Georgetown, but then when I was young, my family, I haven't lived that long, but from what I hear from my grandparents, for the past 5 generations, we've always visited Penang, and they've always lived in Northern Road, you know, which was like a little Mountbatten Road. So and then I was quite sad to hear that it wasn't part of the protected thing, and if it's going to be full. So one of the things that the only thing I wanted to maybe ask you all is, what do you think we should, or when asked, suddenly when you have no choice, especially in Singapore, sometimes we are made to choose. So what do you choose to preserve, and what do you not? And you give way to development. Now, when I was asked to do the waterfront, and then the National Museum commissioned me, and they said, well, you can do the waterfront, and what would you like to choose? Do you want to choose the Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's years? And I said, oh no, everyone is doing that last year. So I said, well, why don't I choose something a bit earlier? And something which Imran did say today that echoed, I said, I talked to the museum, and I said, I'd like to choose a moment in time in Singapore where I can see a heightened multiracial aspect of our waterfront, the participation, the most diverse that I can find. And I happened to choose that time in the 1950s because I could see, you know, a young Singapore, self-governing, but then with still British involvement, with a lot of American military interest in that area, so I chose that time because I thought, well, that was perhaps, if I had to choose, I didn't have a choice. If I had a choice, I would choose from Raffles all the way. So I chose that time. So the waterfront that I chose was that. But I wanted to ask, you know, if, with that kind of question, listening to today and what to dispose, you know, it's quite sad to hear what you have to give up and what you have to retain. What are your views on that?
I think, well, I mean, the decision makers, I mean, it wouldn't be one decision maker, but decision makers should look at the context, of course, and the quality of the, you know, what is to be preserved. So usually, I mean, in terms of age, we try to, because of scarcity, we try to preserve whatever is old. I mean, in our, maybe we can define it as pre-Merdeka or pre-Second World War, but there's also modern architecture that needs to be preserved. And modern architecture, because there's also good, bad, and ugly, then you would have to be more concerned about the quality and, you know, the architects behind the architecture.
I mean, it's a really tough one, isn't it? Because if you're not careful, if you leave it to a handful of individuals, they might become the style police. And I think that can be quite dangerous as well. But generally, I would say that the heritage boards that I've come across not only in Singapore, but in Holland and in the UK, places that I've worked before, have a good balance between trying to understand what is the character of a place from a particular period in time and to what that future heritage might be. And so if I was to take an example in the UK, the works of, say, Erno Goldfinger, as a modernist architect who was obviously heavily involved with the sort of the brutalist movement. Now, at the time, they were the scourge of the earth. Nobody wanted it. But today, they're very, very sought after. And I think that it does take a lot of guts for a panel of both professionals and lay people to be able to make that decision to say that this is of a particular quality. And then think about St. Paul's Cathedral, all right? I love that example because when the Great Fire of London of 1666 took place, St. Paul's Cathedral was kind of razed to the ground. Christopher Wren, astronomer royal, general surveyor to the king, architect, mathematician, he was charged with trying to come up with a new idea. He was a bit cheeky because he did a really crap design and then a really good one. The really good one is the one that we remember today, that sort of slightly Baroque dome, right? But the really bad one, he was deliberately showing it to King Charles to kind of say, look at this, it's great, isn't it? Hoping that King Charles would say, no, it's terrible, show me another one. And then he would reveal. Unfortunately, King Charles picked the bad one. And it's like, you can imagine that. Are you serious? So he basically spent the next few years trying to convince King Charles that actually he made a bad choice. And he tried to steer him in the direction of the Baroque dome. And eventually he got his way. But by that time, the people of London had made up their mind and started building their places all over again. So the vision, which was originally a French vision, he wanted to actually follow the boulevards of France. He wanted to follow a very, very sort of French form. It never really came to pass. That's why we have terrible one-way streets. That's why we're kind of constantly in gridlock. But what it demonstrates is that every single period of time, we always have that issue of what can be sustained and what should be sort of retained. And everybody's going to be offering some element of objection. And even when St. Paul's was built, and this beautiful building that we love so much today, it was actually hated at the time. They kind of thought it was like a French or an Italian imposition into London. So I think we need to be giving a lot of credit to those who are actually trying to make those slightly awkward decisions. But I think it's a very, very sensitive topic because it can't just be in the hands of a few individuals that are playing the style police. And I think that's why trying to get that balance is absolutely right, so that we know that in the future, it's not just the old buildings that are being preserved, it's also some of the buildings that are very, very important and iconic today. And a lot of those are actually with a very climatic bias to them because we're in an age of climate change.
Next, Ishan.
Hi. I've heard a lot about how Georgetown has been a lot better preserved than Malacca, for example. And as a Malaysian and an honorary Malaysian, a Malaysian by heritage, I was wondering, could you tell us more about the background of what's happening in various Malaysian cities with conservation of the built heritage, etc.?
With Georgetown, of course, it was because of rent control, which we had until the year 2000. And then the heritage movement was well on its way by the 90s. So we managed to survive the boom until 1997, and then there was an Asian financial crisis, and then the pressure was not as much to redevelop. But with the other cities, there hasn't been a very strong local civic movement, unfortunately. Malacca is just that Malacca was always much smaller in terms of the size of the city. And because of that, it tends to be overwhelmed by new development. And now that there's a development, there's reclamation, and there's new development around it, even kind of, distorting the context of Malacca as a city that grew up along the river. And And then as for the other towns, small towns, people are starting to become very proud of their small towns. It's just a starting point, I would say. So there are restoration projects here and there, even in small towns, but they tend to be quite isolated. And the local governments are still, they can't really tell the difference. They don't really have a strong policy for heritage. So I think in Penang we were quite lucky that we had the heritage movement starting relatively earlier. KL is, there is Badan Warisan Malaysia, Malaysian National Trust, but I think the development there is so strong, that they are just focusing on a few landmarks.
Oh, I don't really know what to say to that. I did a TV episode on Malaysia for my TV show called City Time Traveller, and it was almost like a quest for identity. And what I found, which was very enlightening, I mean, I go to these places, and it just makes me realize how little I know. No matter what you get put up on a pedestal. You get to talk on TV. You get to talk at these events. But the most humbling experience is when you're actually going into these cities and you just always discover something new. And what that insight into KL gave me was that layering of history, the sort of that element of the Mughal Saracenic sort of architecture influence in the British colonial times when you're looking at the KL railway station, and then that quest for post-colonial independence. There was that need to try and embrace modernity, but still try and also embrace an element of motif, and we see that in the National Mosque. And then by the time you get to the 90s, it's almost kind of hero building, and Mahathir Mohamad's sort of quest to kind of leave a legacy in the Petronas Twin Towers, which, albeit a modern high-rise building, the plan form has a lot of symbolism in the Islamic geometry. And then you've got, on the other hand, people like Ken Yang, who's eschewing the need for cultural motif to actually say that the climate of the place can actually generate the architecture. And so something can be resolutely modernist and quite technologically advanced, but is all about the climate as opposed to trying to have motifs and symbolism. And so what that tells me is that there is no one defining piece of identity. One needs to look at it as a collective, and each era tells its own story. So that was my take anyway.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. I think it's now 6:30, and we've had a long day and a very fulfilling, interesting day. Thank you very much for your time, and can we have a round of applause for all our speakers and our panelists here?